Systems and connections direct and can obstruct our attention. And so the danger of taking a system and imposing it upon the text, or looking for patterns in the text where they may not exist, being over-eager to try and fit everything into a pattern, one of the dangers of that is that it can obscure our perspective on other aspects of the text that may be more important. It can also have the effect of directing our attention away from features of the text that present us with a fuller view. Often people use systems in a way that constrain the text, not allowing it to exceed those systems and structures that they have imposed upon it. Now, that system may be a predetermined system of theology that is imposed upon every single text, or it may be a particular structure, literary structure, like a chiasm, or a parallel structure that people are looking for in a variety of different texts. And they see something that looks promising, and then they try and shoehorn everything else into that structure. These, again, are things of which we should beware. So what are some of the controls? I think one of the most basic controls is the actual letter of the text. When we read the scripture in Theopolis, again and again we're trying to return to the letter of the text, the details, to recognize that the text itself directs our reading. And so if we're looking for some sort of parallel between texts, theological or thematic, we are often looking for specific details in the text that suggest that the two are supposed to be read alongside each other. Sometimes this might be a distinctive turn of phrase. Sometimes it might be a larger pattern that's being played out. And we need to be aware of taking a single detail and running with that without trying to build it up step by step and thinking about the supporting details that flesh out a connection that initially drew our attention. Often these sorts of connections start with a single thing and then get built up. We are always then returning to the text as the touchstone of our readings. And as we return to the text in this sort of iterative process, coming away from the text and thinking about a theory and then bringing that theory back to the text, seeing if the text is illumined by that, and then reading the text over against the theory and seeing how we would push against the theory from the text. That process is one in which the theory will actually become stronger or will rightly be abandoned. And that process of testing the theory is one in which the text's independent voice must always be maintained. The text must always be allowed to stand over against the theory and never be allowed merely to be subsumed into the theory. That independent voice of the text is part of the process of being attentive to it. That process of attention is one that is assisted by good connections, but it's also one in which those connections must always be allowed to be gainsaid by the text. There are times when we come back to a theory in the light of a text and we think, maybe it was not there after all. And on those occasions, we either abandon the theory or we hold the theory a lot lighter than we would have done previously. That process is also one in which we're trying to discern the plausibility of certain connections. Now, the plausibility of connections can be established in various ways. For instance, there are some connections that just are implausible because the sorts of connections that are required are anachronistic, for instance. There is something that comes later in history that we're trying to connect to something that would not have a connection in that period of history. Or maybe there are two texts and we're trying to suggest that this text has arisen from reflection upon this other text, and that other text actually came later in history. In that case, we can dismiss the connection because there is no plausibility to it whatsoever, because the other text came after. There are other occasions when we find that two texts might have a connection, but they are not that proximate to each other. Proximity of texts can be seen in a variety of ways. Usually, it will be a number of different connections that build up over a period of time as we're reading through the text. Sometimes it's the fact that the text has the same context or the same author, or is part of the same collection, or that that text was clearly read by this author of this text that we're reading. In these cases, we're always attentive to details in the text that suggest proximity from which we discern the plausibility of certain connections more broadly. Those connections are also connections in the broader cultural context. If we're reading certain texts of Scripture, we need to think in terms of the context of ancient Israel, or the context of the 1st century AD in certain places within the diaspora. And we're trying to situate that text within a world and to discern within that world what sort of texts, what sort of ideas, what would be some of the connotations that certain words would have for people? What would be some of the alarm bells that would ring with certain expressions that were used? So if we're reading Paul, we're maybe thinking about, in the context of the Roman Empire, are his expressions going to have imperial connotations? How will people hear those words in Philippi, for instance? And then how would people who are familiar with the Old Testament texts, something like the book of Isaiah, how would they hear his words concerning the gospel? Let's say we're reading Paul's statements about the gospel. Should we read that chiefly in terms of somewhere like Isaiah chapter 40 and statements of the good news in the context of the prophets? Or should it be seen in the light of the imperial proclamation of good news with the great victory of an emperor or the birth of a new king? These questions are not necessarily ones that will lead us to a mutually exclusive answer. Often we might discern a meaning that allows for both connotations to coexist. There is political language in Scripture, for instance, that has a number of imports. It can be read against the backdrop of the Old Testament witness in the prophets, and it can also be read against the backdrop of its cultural context within the 1st century Roman Empire. There is no reason why we have to play these things over against each other. Yet often, one of those two contexts will be more prominent. And in Theopolis, typically we see the importance of the canonical witness as that more prominent context. And so we're looking in Scripture and in those most proximate books of Scripture for the sorts of connections that we are finding. Those connections might be found, for instance, in the book of Acts, in the book of Luke. So we go through the book of Acts and we see all sorts of parallels with the book of Luke. There's a sort of panel structure where both of them stand over against each other and the events of the one can be mapped onto the other. Yet reading Luke, we often see that there are parallels with books like 1 Samuel. And so we're listening to the book of Luke and hearing something of the voice of the establishment of the first kingdom. And in that parallel, maybe we're recognizing something that makes it more plausible when we're arguing for a specific connection between Luke and 1 Samuel. We've seen a variety of connections, and so any given connection that follows is a bit more plausible. Likewise, if we're reading something like John's Gospel, it starts off with the words, "In the beginning was the Word." We're instantly hearing the voice of Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. We're instantly being placed within the world of the original creation. And so as we go through that chapter and see a sequence of 7 days, the idea that that is connected to the creation days becomes more plausible because we've already heard the voice of the creation account in verse 1 of that chapter. And so we're paying attention to these criteria of plausibility.